Before you hit the back button thinking this is just another nostalgia trip, ask yourself this. When was the last time you spent 3 hours carefully selecting songs, recording them in perfect order, and hand-decorating a case just to give someone a piece of your soul? If you can't remember, or worse if you've never experienced it, then you need to hear this story. Because what we lost wasn't just cassette tapes and shopping malls. We lost something far more valuable, and most people don't even realize it's gone. Subscribe now, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly what disappeared between then and now, and why an entire generation is still mourning it. Picture this. It's 1994 and you're holding something more valuable than any playlist could ever be. It's a 90-minute cassette tape, and it took you nearly 4 hours to make. Not because the technology was slow, though dial-up internet crawled at a painful 56 kilobytes per second, but because every single song had to mean something. You couldn't just click and drag. You had to wait for the perfect moment between tracks, hit pause at exactly the right millisecond to avoid dead air, and most importantly, you had to feel it. Each song was a conscious choice, a deliberate message, a piece of your identity pressed onto magnetic tape. The mixtape wasn't just music. It was a language. In an era before text messages, before email became ubiquitous, before you could pour your heart out in a 3-paragraph Instagram caption, teenagers communicated through carefully curated compilations of other people's words set to music. If you made someone a mixtape, you were saying something you couldn't say out loud. The order mattered. The transitions mattered. Whether you included that one slow song in the middle or saved it for the end, that mattered too. And the person receiving it? They analyzed it like archaeologists examining ancient hieroglyphics, searching for hidden meanings in every track selection. Cassette tapes had peaked in 1989 with sales reaching 83 million units in the United States alone. By 1992, CDs had started pulling ahead in sales, but teenagers clung to cassettes because they offered something CDs never could: the ability to record, to create, to customize. Japan sold an estimated 500 million cassette tapes in 1989, a staggering number that reflects just how central this technology was to youth culture worldwide. These weren't just purchased albums. These were blank canvases waiting to be filled with teenage emotion, rebellion, heartbreak, and hope. The physical act of making a mixtape required presence. You couldn't multitask your way through it. You sat there, in your bedroom, with your radio or CD player connected to your tape deck, waiting for songs to play or manually queuing up tracks. You wrote the track list on the insert card with your actual handwriting. Sometimes you doodled on it. Sometimes you made elaborate cover art. The Walkman, which Sony had introduced in 1979 and which became ubiquitous throughout the 80s and 90s, meant you could carry this personalized soundtrack everywhere. You controlled your sonic environment in a way that felt revolutionary. Before the Walkman, music was communal or stationary. After it, music became personal, private, and portable. This personalization changed everything about how teenagers related to music and to each other. According to cultural researchers, the Walkman's unprecedented combination of portability and privacy made it the ideal product for young people seeking independence and individual identity. You weren't just listening to what the radio decided to play. You were crafting your own world, your own mood, your own story. And when you shared that story with someone else through a mixtape, you were inviting them into the most intimate corners of your life. But here's what made the 90s different from today: that intimacy required effort. It required time. It required vulnerability. You couldn't delete a mixtape if the person didn't respond the way you hoped. Once you handed it over, it was out there, permanent, real. There was no taking it back, no editing the message, no unsending. The stakes felt higher because the investment was greater. And maybe that's exactly why those connections felt deeper. Now let's talk about the second pillar of 90s teen culture: the mall. If mixtapes were the language of teenage emotion, malls were the geography of teenage freedom. Not the carefully curated, Instagram-ready, outdoor lifestyle centers of today. We're talking about the sprawling, climate-controlled, fluorescent-lit temples of consumer culture that became the de facto community centers for an entire generation. Why did teenagers flock to malls? According to research conducted in the 80s and 90s, shopping wasn't even high on their list of reasons. Studies found that when asked what they liked best about the mall, 42% of teenagers reported being with other people. When asked what they came to the mall to do, they mentioned meeting members of the opposite sex, playing video games, having fun, seeing friends, and people watching. The mall was somewhere you could always find someone. It was turf. Young people who frequented malls even had names for themselves: mall rats for males and mall bunnies for females. Think about what this meant in practical terms. In the era before cell phones became standard, before GPS tracking, before Find My Friends, Parents couldn't monitor their teenagers' every move. When you told your parents you were going to the mall, that's all they knew. They didn't know if you actually stayed at the mall or if you met up with friends and went somewhere else. They couldn't text to check in every 30 minutes. They had to trust you, and you had to navigate the world using your own judgment. This freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. A 1991 Los Angeles Times article on unsupervised teenagers revealed the complexity of this independence. Some thrived with it. Others struggled. But almost all of them experienced something that's increasingly rare today: the opportunity to make their own mistakes, face their own consequences, and develop their own internal compass without constant adult intervention. By the 1990s, an estimated 3.5 million children in the United States were latchkey kids, meaning they came home from school to empty houses and spent the hours between 3 and 6 p.m. unsupervised. This was 7% of all children between ages 5 and 13. For Generation X, born between 1961 and 1981, approximately 40% grew up as latchkey kids. These numbers reflected massive social changes. Divorce rates had more than doubled between the late 1960s and early 1970s, and the number of working mothers in the workforce doubled between 1969 and 1996. The consequences varied wildly. Some latchkey kids developed remarkable independence and self-sufficiency. Others fell into trouble. But here's what's crucial: they had room to figure it out. As one researcher noted, this teen culture of independence grew and evolved for decades, but it has been fading away since the 1990s. By 2000, many of those same Generation X kids who'd been latchkey children became the overprotective helicopter parents of Generation Z, having learned firsthand how dangerous unsupervised hours could be. But in the 90s, that shift hadn't happened yet. Teenagers still had breathing room. The mall exemplified this perfectly. It was a semi-public space where teens could gather without adult supervision, where they could experiment with social dynamics, test boundaries, and figure out who they were. Sure, there were security guards and rules, but compared to today's constant surveillance, it was freedom. Ethnographic research on teenage mall behavior revealed fascinating patterns. Teenagers weren't just passively consuming. They were actively transforming the space. Through tactics like shopping, loitering, and watching the crowd, they temporarily reconfigured the mall to produce a space of their own. They understood the mall as both a commercial setting and a social laboratory. They knew which stores were cool and which weren't. They knew where to sit, where to see and be seen, where to disappear when they needed privacy. Stores like Hot Topic, founded in 1989 in Southern California, specifically catered to this teenage culture. Starting with skulls, crucifixes, spike bracelets, and pyramid belts, Hot Topic became known by 1991 as the loudest store in the mall, a title that perfectly captured how teenagers were asserting their presence in commercial space. This wasn't just shopping. This was identity formation happening in real time, in physical space, with actual human interaction. And that interaction was unfiltered. When teens met someone at the mall, they had to talk to them face to face. Research from the era found that 39% of teenagers reported they had never exchanged phone numbers with someone they just met at the mall, while 61% had done so at least once, with 37% having done it 3 or more times. These were real social risks being taken, real connections being formed, real rejections being experienced. No swiping. No ghosting. No hiding behind screens. Just humans being awkward, brave, stupid, and genuine in equal measure. Now, if you're thinking this all sounds chaotic and unsupervised and possibly dangerous, you're not wrong. And if you're wondering whether we've lost something essential in making childhood safer and more monitored, well, you're not wrong about that either. Because here's the thing that nobody wants to say out loud: freedom is inherently risky. The freedom that 90s teenagers experienced came with real consequences. Some kids got hurt. Some made terrible choices. Some ended up in trouble that might have been prevented with more supervision. But that same freedom also produced resilience, independence, and self-reliance that's increasingly rare today. So before you scroll to the comments to defend modern parenting, stick with me because we're about to dive into exactly what that freedom looked like and why its disappearance matters more than you think. Let's talk about what daily life actually looked like for a teenager in the mid-90s. You wake up, and unless someone in your house is already using the phone line, you might be able to get online. Because dial-up internet meant one connection per household, and it moved at speeds that would make you weep today. But most of your communication didn't happen online anyway. It happened through landline phones, handwritten notes passed in class, and face-to-face conversations. Your morning routine didn't include checking social media because social media didn't exist. There were no likes to count, no followers to cultivate, no carefully curated image to maintain. You got dressed in whatever was trending: baggy jeans, flannel shirts, butterfly clips, chokers, and denim on denim on denim. Fashion was a defining part of the era, but it wasn't driven by influencers. It was driven by what you saw in your school hallways, at the mall, on MTV, and in magazines. You went to school without a cell phone. If plans changed, you had to figure it out. If you missed your ride, you had to problem solve. If you got lost, you had to ask for directions. These weren't occasional challenges. They were daily realities that forced teenagers to develop skills that many young people today simply never need to acquire. According to research on adolescent development, this kind of unstructured navigation of real-world problems was crucial for building executive function and decision-making capabilities. After school, if you were one of the millions of latchkey kids, you went home to an empty house. You had homework to do, chores maybe, but nobody was checking on you minute by minute. You had hours of unstructured time. For some teenagers, this meant watching too much television. For others, it meant getting into increasingly serious trouble. One Oklahoma teenager described a downward spiral into promiscuity, drugs, and alcohol that began during those unsupervised hours. But for many, it meant something else entirely: freedom to explore interests, develop hobbies, figure out who they were without constant adult input. The contrast with today is stark. In 1971, 80% of third graders walked to school alone. By 1990, that number had dwindled to just 9%. This decline in independent mobility continued, accelerating through the 90s and into the 21st century. Today's teenagers have dramatically less freedom of movement than their 90s counterparts did. They're monitored, tracked, supervised, and scheduled to a degree that would have been unthinkable 30 years ago. But back to 1995. Your afternoon might involve calling friends on the landline, each call requiring you to potentially navigate conversations with their parents first. "Hello, Mrs. Rodriguez, is Maria home?" Small talk was mandatory. Social anxiety had to be overcome. You couldn't text. You couldn't DM. You had to actually use your voice, navigate social niceties, be polite to adults, and wait your turn if the line was busy. If you made plans to meet friends, those plans were relatively fixed. No easy way to change them. No, "I'm running late" text. No GPS to guide you there. You memorized directions, looked at maps, or just knew the way. And if someone didn't show up, you waited. You hoped they were okay. You wondered if you'd gotten the time wrong. The social contract required more commitment because flaking was harder to do and easier to notice. Weekend nights often meant heading to the mall or the movies or the arcade. These were the last bastions of public space on the suburban landscape where teenagers could gather. Your parents might have a curfew for you, or they might not. According to the 1991 Los Angeles Times article, some teenagers reported their parents really don't care where I go or when I get home, as long as I'm not escorted by a police officer. Others had strict rules. But even strict rules in the 90s allowed for more autonomy than many teenagers have today. At the mall, you weren't just shopping. You were participating in a complex social ecosystem. You were seeing and being seen. You were finding your people. Maybe you hung out at the arcade. Maybe you loitered near the fountain that appeared in most malls built in the 80s, those stepped, centralized seating areas that became natural gathering points. Maybe you window shopped, tried on clothes you couldn't afford, ate cheap food court meals, and laughed at inside jokes that would become the stories you'd tell for years. And if you were lucky, if you were brave, maybe you met someone. Made eye contact across the food court. Started a conversation at the music store. Got a phone number scrawled on a receipt. These interactions required courage that today's swipe-right culture simply doesn't demand. Rejection was immediate, public, and painful. But connection, when it happened, felt earned. Research on teenage social development suggests that these kinds of face-to-face social risks were crucial for building emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills. The music store was its own universe. You could spend hours flipping through CDs, listening to samples at the listening stations, reading liner notes, studying album art. Music wasn't an infinite scroll of algorithmic recommendations. It was a tangible thing you hunted for, saved up for, treasured. When you bought a CD, you listened to the whole thing, not just the singles. You discovered deep cuts. You formed opinions about bands' entire catalogs. You became an expert in your chosen genres because expertise required dedication and time. And when you wanted to share that music, back to the mixtape. Hours of work, careful curation, personal investment. That's what made it meaningful. The effort was the point. The time you spent was the message. "I spent 4 hours making this for you," said something that "I spent 4 seconds adding you to a playlist" simply never could. Technology was just starting to creep in around the edges by the late 90s. AOL had become the country's biggest dial-up provider by blitzing mailboxes with CDROMS, and all AOL users became AIM users. America Online had over 35 million users who employed its services to access the Internet. By 1997, billions of messages were being transmitted daily through AIM and AOL's other chat services. AOL Instant Messenger represented something new, real-time text communication that didn't require a phone call. You could talk to multiple people simultaneously. You could craft the perfect response before hitting send. You could be bolder online than you ever were in person. But even this early digital communication required more investment than today's social media. You had to be sitting at a computer. You had to be connected via that screeching dial-up connection. You couldn't take it with you. Your conversations happened in specific times and places, not continuously throughout the day. And crucially, those conversations were private. No public performance. No audience. Just you and whoever was on the other end of the chat, figuring things out in real time. According to research published in Gallup Youth Surveys from the 1990s, teenagers of that era maintained remarkably high levels of optimism. In 1992, 86% of teenagers reported being satisfied with the way things were going in their personal lives. They regarded friends, home, and school as the greatest influences on their generation. Their most important personal problems were school grades, career uncertainties, growing pains, fears, and getting along with parents. For the teen generation as a whole, they identified drug abuse, peer pressure, AIDS, teen pregnancy, alcohol abuse, sex, and crime in teen gangs as the most pressing concerns. These weren't kids living in naive bliss. They were aware of dangers and challenges. But they were also confident in their ability to navigate them. They had agency. They had freedom. They had room to make mistakes and learn from them. And they had communities, both physical and emerging digital, where they could test their identities and figure out who they wanted to become. Now, before you click away to go doom scroll through TikTok, ask yourself what we've gained and what we've lost in the decades since. Because understanding that trade-off isn't just nostalgia. It's essential for understanding why an entire generation feels like something irreplaceable slipped away. And if you're still watching, you're about to learn exactly why that matters for everyone, not just people who remember the 90s. But first, let me show you what happened when all of this started disappearing. The shift away from 90s teen culture didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. Technology advanced. Safety concerns increased. Parenting philosophies changed. The same Generation X kids who'd roamed freely as latchkey children became parents themselves and decided their kids would have different experiences. After-school programs expanded. Supervision increased. Scheduled activities replaced unstructured hangout time. The mall started dying. Not all at once, but slowly, relentlessly. Online shopping made physical stores less necessary. Suburban sprawl continued, but with different patterns. The central gathering place that malls represented became obsolete as digital spaces replaced physical ones. By the 2010s, dead malls had become symbols of economic decline and cultural change. Those fountains where teenagers once gathered? Now they sit dry in abandoned buildings, relics of a social ecosystem that collapsed. Mixtapes disappeared too, of course. First came the CD burner in the mid-90s, which changed the equation slightly but maintained the core principle of curation and effort. Then came MP3s, file sharing, iPods, and eventually streaming. By the time Spotify and Apple Music emerged, the entire concept of music as something scarce and precious had evaporated. Today you have access to essentially all recorded music all the time. The barriers are gone. The effort is eliminated. And with them, some would argue, the meaning diminished. But it's not just about tapes and malls. It's about what they represented. Space and time to figure yourself out without constant surveillance, documentation, or judgment. It's about investing hours into something because you cared enough to do it. It's about taking social risks in person, face to face, where rejection hurt but connection meant something real. It's about independence earned through navigation of actual physical and social environments, not virtual ones. Research on adolescent development increasingly suggests that the loss of this independence has had measurable effects. Teenagers today experience higher rates of anxiety and depression. They're developing autonomy later. They're taking fewer risks. They're more isolated despite being more connected. The rise and fall of teen culture of independence from the 50s through the 2020s correlates with significant changes in delinquency rates, social behaviors, and developmental outcomes. None of this is to say the 90s were perfect. They weren't. Real dangers existed. Real harm occurred. The freedom teenagers enjoyed came with genuine costs. But the pendulum has swung so far in the opposite direction that we've created new problems in place of the old ones. We've eliminated certain risks while introducing others. We've made childhood safer in some ways while potentially stunting development in others. The teenagers of the 90s didn't know they were living through something special. They didn't know that the freedom they took for granted would become increasingly rare. They didn't know that future generations would look back with a mixture of longing and disbelief at the idea of spending entire days unsupervised, making mixtapes for hours, hanging out at the mall with no way for parents to reach them. They just lived it, complained about it probably, took it for granted definitely. But now, with the perspective of decades, the distinctiveness of that era becomes clear. It was the last moment before digital technology fundamentally restructured human social interaction. It was the last time teenagers were truly free to disappear into physical spaces and analog activities. It was the last generation to experience music as primarily a tangible, curated, deliberately shared art form rather than an infinite, algorithmically delivered stream of content. And here's what really matters about all of this. It's not just history. It's not just nostalgia. It's evidence that different models of adolescence are possible. The way we currently structure teenage life, with its constant supervision, digital saturation, and scheduled exhaustion, isn't inevitable. It's a choice we've made collectively, often with good intentions, but a choice nonetheless. And if we made this choice, we can make different ones. We can ask whether we've gone too far. We can consider whether some of that 90s freedom might be worth reclaiming, even in modified forms. So what lessons can we take from teen life in the 90s? First, that effort and investment create meaning. Whether it's spending hours making a mixtape or navigating to a friend's house without GPS, the work required to accomplish something makes it matter more. Second, that some degree of unsupervised time and space is necessary for developing genuine independence and self-reliance. Third, that face-to-face social interaction, with all its awkwardness and risk, builds skills that digital communication simply cannot replicate. Fourth, that community spaces where young people can gather matter immensely for social development and identity formation. These aren't just abstract principles. They're practical insights that could inform how we think about adolescence today. What would it look like to give teenagers more unstructured time? What would it mean to create or preserve physical spaces where they can gather with less adult supervision? How might we encourage activities that require sustained effort and investment rather than instant gratification? How can we balance genuine safety concerns with the developmental need for independence and risk-taking? The 90s can't and shouldn't be recreated wholesale. Technology has changed. Society has changed. Some changes have been positive. But that era offers a template for thinking differently about what teenagers need. It reminds us that constant connectivity isn't the same as genuine connection. That safety isn't the same as development. That convenience isn't the same as meaning. That efficiency isn't the same as experience. For those who lived through the 90s as teenagers, the memories remain vivid. The sound of a cassette clicking into place, the smell of the mall food court, the nervousness of calling someone's house, the freedom of long summer days with no oversight, the satisfaction of perfectly timing a song transition on a mixtape, the thrill of running into your crush at the record store, the security of friendships forged through hours of unstructured hangout time. These memories persist not because the 90s were objectively better than any other era, but because they represent something increasingly rare. A childhood and adolescence with room to breathe, space to fail, and time to figure things out without the whole world watching. For those who didn't experience it, the 90s might sound simultaneously appealing and terrifying. How did anyone survive without cell phones? How did you make plans if you couldn't text? How did you not get lost without GPS? How did you not die of boredom without infinite content at your fingertips? The answers are simple. You figured it out. You adapted. You developed skills and strategies. You learned to be present where you were because there was nowhere else to be. You learned to entertain yourself because entertainment wasn't being algorithmically delivered to your face at every moment. You learned to take initiative because nobody was managing your life for you. And maybe most importantly, you learned that you were capable. Capable of navigating the world. Capable of making decisions. Capable of solving problems. Capable of taking risks and handling consequences. Capable of being bored and finding your way out of boredom. Capable of connecting with people and maintaining those connections through effort and intention. This capability, this confidence, this independence, this is what 90s teenagers gained through their freedom, and it's what current teenagers are losing through their constraint. The question isn't whether we can return to 1995. We can't, and frankly we wouldn't want to. But we can ask whether the pendulum has swung too far. We can question whether every technological convenience is an unqualified good. We can wonder whether our children are better off for having less freedom than we did. We can examine the data on adolescent mental health, developmental outcomes, and social skills, and we can admit that maybe, just maybe, some of what we lost was worth keeping. Teen life in the 90s wasn't perfect. It was messy, risky, sometimes dangerous, often chaotic. But it was also real, embodied, invested, and free in ways that current teenage life simply isn't. The mixtapes represented hours of thought and care. The malls represented physical community and social risk-taking. The freedom represented trust, responsibility, and the opportunity to develop genuine independence. These weren't luxuries. They were essentials. And their absence in contemporary adolescence isn't just nostalgic loss. It's developmental deficit. So here's your final call to action. Whether you lived through the 90s or you're just learning about them now, think about what this means. Think about what we've traded and whether we got a fair deal. Think about whether the teenagers in your life have enough space, time, and freedom to figure out who they are. Think about whether constant connection has made us more connected or more isolated. Think about whether efficiency and safety have come at too high a cost. And then, maybe, think about making a mixtape. Not because cassette tapes are superior technology, but because the act of spending hours curating and creating something meaningful for another person is a radical act of care in a world of algorithmic playlists and instant everything. Think about it. Then subscribe, share this with someone who needs to understand what we lost, and keep the conversation going. Because remembering isn't enough. We have to learn from it.